Welcome back, everybody. It's the last presentation and on the last day of IBC. It's been a great past 4 days, and it's amazing. Thank you all for watching us live. We have Xander Ross, who is an amazing filmmaker from Red Saturn. He's a founder of Red Saturn, and also we'll be talking about how he uses Red Giant in his workflow while using VFX to improve the no-budget filmmaking. His work is really amazing, so let's have a look what he has to say.
So I'm just going to wait for it to pop up on the screen so everyone can see. There we go. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about using VFX to improve no-budget filmmaking. My background is in no-budget production. So Red Saturn itself is a production company set up by me within the past year or two. We specialize in independent and no-budget filmmaking and media production. And the key to this, from what I've found, is that it's about learning what corners you can cut without people realizing. Because quite often, a lot of the time, you don't need to do things the conventional way, and you can cut a lot of the traditional processes and time and budget in half if you know the different way of doing it. So I'm just going to show now the showreel of some previous projects we've worked on.
Adam, do you know why you're here today?
Would you like to see a magic trick?
So that brings me very neatly on to the real question of what on earth am I actually talking about today? Because it's all well and good showing you some cool visuals up there, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, then that's a little bit useless. So today, as I said before, I'm going to be discussing some of the best practices and workflows that I've found over my years of working on films and different productions, and specifically talking about how VFX and post-production can be used to help when you've got a lot less of a budget than a lot of the kind of bigger players out there, and especially if you're kind of just starting out, if you're a student, that sort of thing. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Red Giant suite. Now, circling back, though, about these student productions, if you are a student or in education, I've said this to everyone I know already, but it is possibly the best purchase you can get. I think it's maybe about $10 for the education subscription. It lasts about 6 months. I'm not 100% sure on that, so please double check. But it's fantastic. It gives you access to all of these tools. So the first thing, before we get into some of the technical side, is this misconception that I found when working with a lot of directors and producers. which I'm probably preaching to the choir here with a lot of you guys, and that is that VFX is not for post-production at all. In fact, what I've found is that VFX works best when you actually do it in pre-production, and it's been worked on long before you ever step on set with a camera. So what this really involves is before you get on set and before you've got your actors on your location, you know exactly what the VFX shots you want are, what you want them to look like. And the reason for this is that it saves time and money. Oh, let me go back. It saves time and money in post-production, allowing for a much higher quality of final product, such as being able to match lighting and enhancing the effect. And I'll go on to this a little bit more with some examples next. So the next one as well that I frequently find myself arguing with a lot of directors and producers I've worked with initially, and as someone who dabbles in VFX and editing and directing, producing, writing, is this idea of, oh, no, that's great, but I'm not a VFX artist. I'm just a producer. I'm just a cinematographer. I don't touch anything when it comes to post. And that's great. But the problem with that is that there's three real main reasons why you need to know VFX, even if you're not a VFX artist. And so whether you're, as I said, director, producer, or cinematographer, the reason why you need to know these things are, number one, you need to know what's actually possible in VFX. You can't really just go, we've shot it, it looks good, we've got these high-end cameras, it'll be fine. The VFX guys can wave their magic wands, they can fix it in post. It doesn't work. And even if it does, you're then adding months onto your production in post to try and get it looking as good as it should do. Number two is kind of building on from that, and it's that idea of if you know what's possible, you're going to be able to film it better. So, for instance, that can just be a case of you're shooting it with tracking markers on set, you're knowing that, say, oh, we're going to need to add a cape onto our actor, so let's adjust costumes so that there's not a cape that we need to remove in post. And the other one is also just the very simple one of, it doesn't matter what production you're on, inevitably, things are going to go wrong. We've all been there. And in fact, recently, I had a production where what ended up happening was we're shooting in a studio, and as with a lot of time in the studio, you get this gorgeous custom-built set, but you've not got a ceiling on there. And so what ended up happening was our DOP came in for the final shot. He wanted to do this panning shot across, but you could see at the very top of the frame big open section of very clearly studio warehouse. And what we realized was the fact that because I'd already done 3D tracking before, I'd already done VFX work before, I knew that I could just go in post, easily track the footage, and add the ceiling back in. And rather than having to panic about, oh, how are we going to be able to do this? Are we going to be able to do that? We knew instantly how it works, how we needed to film it, and what needed to be done. And so even if you're not the person doing the VFX yourself, you're going to really stand out when you're on a production when everyone else is panicking because, oh, we've not got the green screen working right on here, and the DOP's come up with this idea for a shot, but that's not going to work for that. If you can go, oh, actually, yeah, I know how you do this. We just need to tweak this, shoot it this way, and then you're still going to be able to add those effects. And so the next stage, kind of building on this idea of doing it in pre-production, is the idea of, if you can, you want to do as much previs as possible, both in terms of what you're shooting and especially for your VFX. So this is actually a screen grab from a film we did called Secret Identity, which I'll go on to in a little bit more later, where basically, we brought our actor in the studio to test out, okay, let's shoot him on the green screen, let's work out how we've got to get the lighting to work, let's work out how we've got to get the costume looking, so that rather than needing to kind of deal with the budgetary side of, oh, we've got 50 people on set and we're playing around for 20, 30 minutes with lighting to make it look right, we had me, the DOP, and one lighting guy and the actor in the studio, and we just played around for a day, getting the lighting right, getting different angles, and then we could play in post several times. I think we actually ended up doing about 4 versions of this shot. And the real reason for that is you iron out issues. So what we actually discovered when we did this was it didn't work in a studio at all. And so what we were able to do, because we knew that, was we could then find the solutions to those problems. So what we tested was, we then tested, I think used myself as the subject for it, where we then tried it in different locations. And what we ended up doing, I'll come back to in the example, is we ended up shooting it on location. So really what this also culminates in is this idea that VFX is ultimately just a tool in your arsenal. You know, it's the same as a tripod or a dolly or a gimbal. They're fantastic tools and they get you fantastic results. But really, if you're not using them to enhance your story, you're not using them to enhance what's already there, you're ultimately just using it as a bandage. And so the best example of this with using it to enhance is also just practically, you want it to be enhancing and complementing the footage you've already got. And so the best example of this with something like green screen would be having your lighting match what you want it to look like. So for instance, if you know in pre-production that, oh, the actor's going to be stood here, we're going to have a fireplace thrown in behind them in 3D there, what I'd recommend is get a flickering light in the background so you've got that warm orange glow coming on them, because otherwise you're having to try and simulate that in post and it never looks as good as it does if you do it practically. So the first example of what I'm going to talk about is a short film we did called Expiration Date. We released this about a year ago. Now, for context, and this is really where I'm going to make the point of, I know a lot of people say gear doesn't matter, and then they kind of undermine themselves by going, yeah, gear doesn't matter. That's why we shot this on a 20 grand cinema camera with a multi-million-dollar production company behind us. This we didn't. This was a true no-budget sci-fi comedy. It was produced for under £50, which I'm not sure the exact conversion rate, but that's pennies compared to most productions. And we shot it on a Canon 1300D, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, it is an APS-C sensor. It is an 8-bit camera that just about shoots 1080p. It doesn't have a mic port. It doesn't even have a log profile built in. We had to add that in after the fact. Magic Bullet Lantern doesn't work. This was a starter camera 10 years ago for photography. It's not built for video. So the question is, how did we enhance it? Well, number one, we shot it on vintage lenses. So we shot it on the Helios 44-2, which is a really cheap, gorgeous vintage lens that you can pick up used from places like eBay. And again, this goes into this fact that VFX and enhancing your production isn't just about what you're doing in post. It's about what you're doing and what you're putting in front of the camera practically. And so to prove that, you know, this does work, I'm going to go on to the bit of a humble brag here of recently, as of making this project, Expiration Date has had over 75,000 views on YouTube. And so the real question you're probably going to be asking yourself is, well, that's great, but how on earth do I take something like that and turn it into this? And so that's what I'm going to walk you through now. So the first step in this case was we actually ended up rotoscoping our actor out. Now, initially, we toyed with the idea of using a green screen, but we were wanting to go very run and gun for this project, so we didn't really have the time to kind of set up and collapse to green screen and match it across. Now, obviously, you can do this in a lot of different programs. We used After Effects because that's what I'm most familiar with. And you could use masking instead, but with Rotobrush, it's fantastic for getting these details and masking it out really quickly. And so once you've got that done, what we then did was we took some stock elements of a tree line, added them back in, and blurred them to match the camera lens blur that we had natively. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, that's great, but I'm not going to spend an hour and a half in VFX just to change what the trees look like. And I wouldn't blame you. What we then did was, really, we adjusted the blur. And this is the advantage of using rotoscope rather than using green screen. It's that we could very simply, as you just saw, check whether the camera lens blur for those trees in the background matches. And now, if you look at that, it just looks like we've taken the sky out. And so the next bit that we then did, and this is where we get into a little bit more fancy elements, is we added in our monster shot. Now, we moved this behind the trees to make it look like, obviously, it's behind the trees. And then we connected our foreground element to a null object, because that way, rather than trying to manually reposition it, and every time we move that, something else gets adjusted, and the maps aren't quite right, and all of a sudden your whole shot falls apart. By parenting this to a null object, it means there's only one layer that I've got to move, and it then controls everything in the scene. Now, I actually ended up disconnecting the trees layer, because as you can see, it wasn't quite a big enough layer to work for that. So I just had it controlling our actor. But the beauty of that is that I could then go in and if, say, I'm working with a director that goes, actually, you know, I really like the shot, but I don't really like that take you used to the actor. I could just go in, swap out that, and because it's still connected, the positioning, the animation of everything is still identical. And so this is really when we start building up on this using some of the Red Giant plugins. Now, we're now going to add in the sky back into it using a plugin called Horizon. Horizon, I think, is a little bit of an unsung hero in terms of the plugins for the Red Giant suite, in that what it allows you to do is I can import an EXR sequence, as you've just seen, and literally, this isn't sped up, this is how fast it works in real time. And the reason I use this is because rather than using a stock image of a sky, as you can see, I can play around with that and go, let me find like the exact section of the skyline I want to have in there, let me get like the right number of clouds behind them, and make it look kind of the way that I want it to look. Because really, VFX, I think, is as much about stylization as it is about photorealism. Oh, I zapped forward a little bit there accidentally. Let me go back. Here we go. So the next step that we did on this was, obviously, it looks all right now, but in order to make it look a little bit more like this is some giant 60-foot monster, what we did was we duplicated that horizon layer and used a luminance matte so that after adjusting it a little bit, all that we got on there was the clouds. And so the real advantage to that is that you shove that in front of your monster layer and in front of the clouds, and it looks like it's this massive creature that's peering through the cloud layers, and it really sort of just helps immerse you in that shot a little bit more. And so the next step, obviously, on this, now with the monster layer, obviously, you can go and model that in ZBrush. You can now even do it on the iPad. You can animate it in Cinema 4D. Or what we actually ended up doing was we just took a stock element and added it in that way. Now, what I'm doing at this point is adding in the light layers. So I had a fantastic animator who exported this out as an EXR sequence. So what that meant was, rather than it just being one solid layer, which obviously, again, we parented it to a null object so that we could move all the monster elements at the same time, at the same place, and they perfectly matched. But what it meant was, by having the lighting on a separate layer, I could add this glow effect and dial in exactly how strong and how intense the glow coming off the lighting of that monster looks. And by the way, this is before we've composited anything, and already that's getting close to what you're wanting your final shot to look like. The next step, and this is where really, again, you're just sort of adding these fine details to really sell the effect, is using Super Comp to blend these layers together. And what's absolutely fantastic about this is you've got these elements like haze, and haze, especially when you're doing these sort of cloud effects, really helps as a sort of almost one-button solution to blend those elements together and make it look like they're actually shot on camera together. And it's much, much better and much faster than trying to do this manually. And again, literally, that's how fast it is to color correct, because it analyzes the background layers and the colors on that. And you can then go in and dial that to whatever your tastes are and make sure it looks exactly the way that you want it to look. And so finally, in terms of stylization, what we did was we wanted a bit of a rack focus effect of sort of, as he sees this monster, we wanted it to look like the camera focus was shifting across to it. So that one's just a very simple case of we added a camera lens blur effect to both our monster layer and our foreground layers, and just animated it so that as one went into focus, the other one went out of focus. From there, we did what I call the secret sauce layer, which is basically where you've already got it looking good, but now you're just adding that little bit of extra something to make it look good. And so the special thing I like in adding onto this is magic bullet looks, because although traditionally you want to be grading your shots in post and sending it off to your colorist, you still want to be using these sort of effects, especially things like optical diffusion and halation and chromatic aberration, because in addition to the kind of basic things like matching your grain, it really just sort of blends your scene together and helps it look a little bit more like those imperfections you get if you actually shot it in camera. And so that leads me beautifully on to color grading, and how color grading especially is really what can help create a higher image quality and not only blend your VFX together, but also enhance the quality of the footage that you've captured on set. Now, the base version of this that a lot of people use is using kind of pre-made LUTs. Often as well, the beauty of a lot of these software is the fact that Magic Bullet looks, you can save presets and they work across software. So I can go in and do a mock-up of what it'll roughly look like in After Effects, save that, and then use that in DaVinci when I'm doing my proper color grade along with the rest of the footage that isn't having any VFX on. And so the reason why you want to so this is what it looks like when you add the color grade back on. And so again, one of the small things that I like adding in on color grades is the film stock emulation that you get as part of the Red Giant suite, but also these really subtle effects that you can see on the edges where I add a little bit of radial blur and some chromatic aberration to just mimic that sort of lens fall off that you get on a lot of older and vintage lenses. And it just adds a lot more character to your image and makes it look a lot more unique and less like something that's just been churned out by a computer. So the next thing we're going to go on to is 3D shots. 3D shots is another fantastic thing for really upping the perceived production quality of whatever you're working on. And so generally, you can often supplement these expensive shots that you wouldn't be able to otherwise get using software like Cinema 4D. And really, though, because I'll hold my hands up and admit, while I dabble in 3D, it's not my main focus. I'm much more of a compositor. But it's hilarious looking at how different shots I've exported look before and after I add these compositing effects. So a lot of the time, again, it goes back to adding that texture and adding that realism to it. So this is going to be an example, again, from Expiration Date. This was the actual opening title sequence where we started off with a 3D rendered shot of a planet. I added in just some basic text, centered it on the image, and because I then had the title of the film, I could then go, well, you know what? That looks a bit boring. And so to add a little bit more depth, a little bit more texture to it, I set it to be a 3D layer and added a point light to it. And what that does is it adds a naturalistic and really subtle vignette effect to the edges to help sort of create a little bit more contrast, a little bit more texture to that. And the other thing that I added onto it was I added a really subtle Gaussian blur onto your text, because what that does is it just really helps with setting it so that it doesn't look so sharp and it doesn't look so crisp and computer generated. Because what we were going for with this was this sort of old school LED, sort of LED matrix sort of look. And so the next step we did on here, which as you've got to have on any LED, is your LED blue glow. Because everyone knows with tech, if it's got blue LEDs on it, that makes it high tech. So the quickest way we did with that is optical glow, which, as you've just seen, is that fast in adding glow effects onto it. And then, again, this is much more of an art than a science. You then just play around with the size and the amount and the fall off to play with kind of how much of an effect it has on the text, where it's affecting on the text. And the other advantage to kind of adding that vignette before is the fact that, as you can see, because it mostly works on the highlights, I get a much more intense glow effect at the center of the text rather than on the edges. And it just looks so much more interesting than just slapping on being pinged. getting an announcement. Apologies about that. So as I was saying, the next step that I really love doing for adding that texture to your render is the chromatic aberration plugin. So sometimes it's really good just for text. So as you can see, it sort of splits your red, green, and blue channels and mimics that sort of imperfections you get on an actual older lens where it disperses those values differently. And for things like text, I found it's especially good to just go very subtle on it, almost imperceptible. But what we then do is we then added, again, another one of, I think, the unsung heroes, which is Universe and Multiply, which basically takes out the black background and gives you the transparency layer back. And so what that meant was I could then take that effect with all the glow effects and the chromatic aberration and throw that back over the 3D render. And so, again, because you've got this procedural workflow, I could then go in and go, actually, I'm not really 100% happy with that font. I know that's the style I want it to look like, but let me see what it looks like in a different font. Let me tweak the spacing of it. Let me tweak the sizing of it. And it all adjusts in real time. So the next thing that I added in to really add to this sort of mimicking those lens imperfections was some light leak and haze effects, which, again, is literally just slapped on top and using a screen mode in order to mask it on. And then the next step on there is adding a little bit more chromatic aberration using an adjustment layer. So the reason we do this is because by having it on an adjustment layer, it affects everything below it. So if I had to re-render that background, I wouldn't have to change anything. So with this one, what I did was I went for a very different effect of, I knew that I wanted a much stronger image. I wanted it to look like those sort of wide angle shots you get from space, and where you're almost looking through some sort of like space window, some window in a space station. So what you get on that is, and what you always see on those sort of thing is, space is really cold, so you're going to get a little bit of condensation, which is what I wanted to sort of add in there. Now, I believe you can also now add this in using real lens flares as well. I was more familiar with it on chromatic aberration, which is why I use that. But as you can see, you can go in there and you can play around with exactly what sort of texture you want on there, how much of the texture you want visible. And as you can see, it's almost imperceptible what you've added, but it just adds that touch more texture and that touch more realism that it doesn't look like you've just slapped a render button and thrown it into your film. It looks like something that you've actually shot and has actually been shot in space and pulled back down. So again, we did the same effect of the camera lens blur to simulate a camera rack focus, because again, you're never going to get everything in focus. So I'll zap through that because we've already gone over it. And then, once again, we used Magic Bullet Looks to help blend these effects together and really sort of just mix it all together and make it look like it's all been shot at the same time. So I'm now going to move on to the next film we worked on. And this was called Secret Identity. Secret Identity was a film I'd had in development for about 5 years. And we're lucky enough, as you can see there, to be nominated for the Royal Television Society Northwest Student Awards. And with that one, we're still operating on quite a low budget, but we actually had cinema cameras to work with. We had a lot more time to work with and play with the VFX, and I knew a lot more VFX, so I could really enhance the quality of it. So the main shot that we had in this film, and the shot that I'm going to be talking about today, is the flying shot, which you guys saw before in the showreel. And now this is a shot which, for those of you that have seen the film, is one of the first shots of the film. It's what sort of engages you in the story and sets the tone for everything else. So beyond the fact that it's a complex shot in its own right, we knew that this had to look photoreal, because if it didn't, we've immediately lost the audience. They're no longer invested in the story. Now, as you can imagine, getting a 9-year-old actor to fly in the air is not the easiest. Contrary to a lot of the jokes I've made, he did not just do that on set, and we're lucky enough to be filming it. Traditionally, this is done using expensive flying rigs. You've got wire work or complex digi-doubles, which you can do, and it's getting more affordable, especially digi-doubles, but we wanted to shoot a lot more practically, and we wanted to capture the actual movements that our actor was doing. So the way we did it is we just shot him on a green screen on location. And so we shot 2 different plates. The first, which we've got in large over here, is the torso, where we basically literally had him on his tiptoes in front of the green screen, balancing. So we actually got that sort of wobble of, he's flying for the first time, isn't really sure what he's doing or how he's doing it. He's not really kind of too confident in it. And then the next bit we got, which you've got on the right over there, is we had a fantastic crew member who has asked to not be named in this presentation, who volunteered to wear a green morph suit in front of the green screen, so that by lifting our actor up, we could then get a shot of just his legs, and we could then comp those 2 shots together to get one whole body shot. Now, what you can see as well is the fact that he's obviously not wearing a cape here. And so I'm going to go through how we added the cape back in, but we knew from doing those previews that we couldn't get the cape looking right when we shot it on a green screen. There wasn't enough room for it. There wasn't enough wind that we were able to produce. And so what we made the decision was we worked with the costume department to develop basically just a shoulder version of the cape. So rather than having to track in a 3D sim of a cape over his shoulders and have it move as his arms go up and down, we just had him actually wearing it. And the advantage to that, as I'm going to get onto later, is that it serves a really good reference point for when we're adding the CGI version in. And so the first thing we did, which I've skipped over because we've already gone over it, is we rotoscoped the top of the actor down to the waist. And the advantage to that is that we then had this movement of, bar his legs, you could see him sort of wobbling around, mostly in one place. And it already was looking a lot like he was sort of floating in the air. And then in order to kind of track the legs across, what we did was we used the motion tracker to track the positioning of our actor, which, because we had him wearing this sort of costume, it was quite easy to track his movements and the motion. And then by parenting that to a null object, what we were able to do was we were able to take the layer of where we had the footage of his legs, have that move with the null object, and so all of a sudden we could control the position and sizing of his legs separately, but it would follow the movement of the rest of his torso. So we didn't have to worry about, he's moved his stomach slightly, the entire shot's out of whack, we've got to manually go in and try and do it. It all does that automatically. And so we then keyed the legs using Primat. Primat is a fantastic keying tool. You can go in and use the auto-define key, which will do a really good approximation of what the kind of key on your shot is going to be. And then you can go in and adjust it manually with the background and foreground tools. What we then had after that was we used Magic Bullet Colorista to adjust the shot of his legs so that way it would blend in better with the shot of his torso and the colors would match a little bit more. And then what we did after that was we added in, because we were struggling to get a good shot of his legs moving all the way, because our crew member was struggling a little bit to hold him up, so we couldn't get his legs moving that much. So what we did was we added CC bend to the shot of his legs, animated the amount so that over the course of it, his legs just sort of move across slightly. It looks like they're moving in an actual shot, but that's just a freeze frame from the footage that we grabbed. So the next step we did was we then took our clean plate from on location, added our actor in, which we'd done in another comp, so that way we could go in and tweak everything with our actor, and it wouldn't affect the rest of the comp. And already, because we'd shot him on location with the green screen behind him, the lighting on our actor matched the lighting on the clean plate behind him. So the next step that we had was we added the cape in. Now, the cape is very simply just a fabric simulation on a 3D plane. I'll avoid getting into that because that's a whole other demo, and I don't think anyone really wants to hear me talk for 20, 30 minutes about fabric simulations. But what that let us do was it let us simulate the movement of a cape in the wind, which really just sort of added to the feeling that he was actually up there flying. And so from there, what we did was we took that rendered cape and adjusted the scale and position of it to match where our actor was in the scene. And because he wasn't really moving that much, what we were able to do was we were able to very simply go in and drop it in behind him. But what we'd actually done, because there was a little bit of movement from him, we took that same null object that we used to track his legs, and we used that to control the movement of the cape, so that when his torso moved at the top, the cape moved along with it. So it looked like it was actually attached to him. And because we took this still frame when we were modeling and lighting it, we were able to mimic the look and render of it to pretty much 90% accuracy of what it looks like. But I wasn't really that happy with how it looked in comparison. I felt it looked a little bit too much like it was something added in after. The contrast wasn't quite right. So what I then did was I actually used the tint effect, because as you can see when we zoom in, the shadows and the highlights aren't quite the same. So what we did was, because we had that reference of what the actual fabric looked like, I could take the highlights and the shadows and use them as reference for mapping the white and black points. And then just adjusting the amount to tint, I could very easily adjust the intensity of that effect, and all of a sudden it looks like it's just an extension of what's on his shoulders. So that goes back to this idea of we had the practical costume as reference because we'd done the previs. So then, again, we parented both the actor and the cape layer to a null object, so that way what I could do is I could play around with where he was in the scene, and it'd all move at once without having to worry about, oh, we've moved the actor and now he's no longer synced with where the cape is. From there, once again, I went into SuperComp and composited all these different elements together. Now, the beauty of this as well is the fact that the composition settings and the blend settings that we wanted for our actor were the same as what we were going to have for the cape. So what I could do is I could go in on either the cape or the actor layer, dial it into exactly how I want it to look, and then copy and paste those effects onto the layer below it, and it'd match it perfectly. And so what we then did was we added colorista on an adjustment layer, because obviously this was all shot in log. So I wanted to have a better idea of what the kind of final shot was going to look like once I graded it, to make sure that it had blended as much as I wanted it to. And while I could go in and do this manually, the really good thing about colorista is the fact that it's got the guided color correction. So if you've never done any color correction before, it walks you through step by step exactly what settings you need to adjust on there to make your shot look like it should do. And so the next step, again, was I decided I'm not quite happy with the comp now I've seen it edited, so let me tweak it a little bit more, let me play with those settings. And because this is all being done live in After Effects, I can go in and just fine-tune those settings and adjust it to how I want it to look. And so, once again, I went in and added Magic Bullet looks on to blend all of these effects together using my favorite one, which was optical diffusion. And the next bit we did was, because we then disabled the colorista because we wanted to look back to how it was before, I then added in, actually, because I looked at that shot and I went, you know, I'm not really that happy with the facial expression of the actor on this take, but we can't really go back and do it again, and it doesn't really look as awe-inspiring as I wanted it to. So what we did was I went in and I used real lens flares to add in a lens flare, which I think it's actually crashed and won't let me show. Hold on. Is it going to show? There we go. And so what that let me do was it let me add in, as you can see, it's now re-enabled those effects, so it looks a lot more like the final grade that I was wanting to add on there. And I could then add in a lens flare next to the actor. Now, obviously, that's the one it has initially, but you can go into the designer and play around and tweak with exactly what you want it to look like. And so what I did was I went in and I adjusted it to create this sense of it looking like a sun was behind him. And so I knew that we wanted to sort of simulate this look of a kind of 50mm anamorphic lens. And so because we knew those settings and we knew that that was the lens that we shot everything on, I could go in and dial that into the lens settings on the designer. I could dial in, okay, this is exactly how big the flare is, this is how big the kind of offset of it is, this is the color temperature of it, this is how big the glow ball of it is. And you can go in and spend hours if you really want, just sort of playing around with all the flare settings to look exactly how you want it to look for your shot, which once we got that done, that then created this effect of he's got the sun behind him, sort of glaring over. You can see that he's flying, but you can't really see the big goofy smile on his face. And again, we tweak the colors a little bit more with Colorista. And then because I looked at it once it was rendered and went, this looks good, but it doesn't quite look realistic enough, I then added onto onto a new adjustment layer the camera shake effect. Now, you can dial this in manually, but if you want to just get something quick, you can use one of the presets and just tweak it from there. And so what we did was we took the handheld preset, dialed down the shake amount so that you got just a little bit of camera shake as he's sort of in the air to mimic what would actually happen if you had some sort of launching into the air and you were adjusting to it with your camera being handheld. And so finally, the last thing we did was I animated the position of our actor to sort of rise up in the scene over the course of the shot so it looked like he was slowly levitating across the ground. Now, what you'll notice here is the fact that it still very much looks like a log shot. And the reason for that is because we wanted to blend it into the other shots that we'd done for the scene that didn't have VFX. So by exporting it as a shot that was still in log and still had all that color data, I could apply the same color grade that I'd applied to the rest of the shots onto this. And so when I did that in DaVinci, this is what the final shot looked like. And all of a sudden, we've taken our actor who was sat in a back garden on a green screen being held up by a crew member in a green morph suit, and he now looks like he's actually flying in the air. Now, one of the recent things that's actually come out to really help with this is a system called ACES. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you are already aware, ACES is a really massive breakthrough for the VFX industry and post-production industry because VFX shots generally are a nightmare to try and match. Trying to get the export from your renderer to match the exact color space of your regular footage, trying to get it to match the stock elements you've added in there is a bit of a nightmare. You can spend hours and hours because the blues don't look quite right and they don't look the same as the blues on that shot. And so what ACES does is basically it's a much wider color gamut. And if this is sounding like rocket science to you, don't worry, it did the first time I heard of it. But what it basically does is, because it's got a much wider range of color information, you export all your shots in ACES, and then you transcode them back to what your final deliverable is going to look like. And so you're not going to lose that color information. And more importantly, all your colors are going to match between your renders. So it doesn't matter if I've exported a shot from Cinema 4D, shot another shot on a Blackmagic, done another one on a Sony I can match the colors of all of them, and you're not going to be able to tell that they've been shot and created in several different places. And so that really brings me to the end of my presentation. I've got my contact details there, as well as a QR code for if you want to scan it that way. But thank you all for watching, and let me know if you've got any questions.
Thank you so much, Xander. Does anybody have any questions for him? You were the most excited to see this presentation. So you have any questions? Rick?
I actually prefer going in and dialing it in on different shots, yeah. I think the presets are fantastic because it really gives you a chance to play around with it and add those effects quickly. But if you've got the time, it's great to be able to play around and dial it in manually on each shot.
Thank you so much, Xander. Thank you, everybody watching. It has been a great IBC for us. Hope it's been amazing for you as well. You can rewatch all the presentation all the days on YouTube channel. We'll be cutting each presentation and posting it on YouTube as well in the coming days. You can obviously see the QR codes for the asset as well as the chance of winning Maxon 1 license on the YouTube channel. And we will hopefully, I'm pretty sure, see you next year. There's a QR code. You can scan it for a chance of winning Maxon 1 license. See you at IBC 2025. Thank you.